Evolution just means that species are changing over time. Now, some important things. This is a species, okay? It's not an individual. Individuals do not evolve. Species evolve, okay? That's really, really important. Individuals don't evolve, but species evolve, okay? So you yourself are not going to evolve. You may contribute to the evolution of your species, but you yourself, you're not going to evolve. You're you. You stay you. That's it. Okay. So there are a few folks that had some ideas about how organisms came to be, or how that kind of worked. Organisms changed. One guy named Cuvier, he had an idea called catastrophism, and that sudden geologic catastrophes cause the extinction of a large group of organisms. That's why he thought lots of how these extinctions came, and that may be the case. For example, right, the meteor that killed the dinosaurs. Right, that would be an example of catastrophism. Okay, and then Charles Lyell, he had this idea that geologic processes that change the Earth work the same in the past as they do now. So there wasn't some crazy thing that randomly killed things. It's just that they were slow and steady. So likely there is a little bit of both going on here, right? You may have these sudden catastrophes, a meteor that killed the dinos could, or like a volcanic eruption. But you also have the fact that like the continents are moving slowly, um, and things like that. So there's probably a little bit of both going on here. Charles Darwin, he went on this boat called the Beagle to the Galapagos Islands. And when he got to the Galapagos Islands, he noticed that there were a lot of different finches, a lot. Like here, this picture has an example of a lot of them. And he found out that he observed these finches, and he noticed that different finches, they had different beaks depending on what they ate. So like, for example, this finch may have gotten, picked little teeny tiny bugs off of the mangroves. So that might have been why he had this, like, this beak kind of like this. Now, a ground finch, right? He may have gotten bigger things off the ground, or maybe nuts, something like that. You see his fin, he looks a little differently. You can see that this was a ground finch, and you see he's got this little teeny tiny thing, so maybe he ate bugs. Okay. Let's see. This was a ground finch, and it has a very sharp beak, so maybe he poked things. He used his sharp beak to like open different things. So there's just a variety of different finches, and he found out they were depending on what they ate. So what he thought that there was probably one finch that this would be the ancestral species. And he thought that maybe this one finch came to the island somehow. Sometimes birds will fly and get off course and land on an island and they can't get back. Sometimes they will ride on different pieces of debris and wash up on an island. It just depends on how an animal gets there. But once an animal gets to an island and it can't get off, a lot of times it starts diversifying as the generations go on, and start like filling different niches on the island that were open, because there maybe weren't a lot of critters on that island, because islands are islands, so it's not very easy for critters to get to them. So he came up with this thing that he called descent with modification, or the process of evolution. So the ones that had the beaks most shaped like this guy, you know, they ended up evolving into ones that ate tiny bugs. You know, the ones that had beaks like this, they kind of evolved into eating, being vegetarians and just eating plants. So it just depends on what they ate, and they kind of diversified into all these different niches that were open on the island. And so then he came up with this process that he called natural selection, which is that individuals that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. Okay, so if you are better adapted to your environment for some reason, whatever it is, you're more likely to survive and reproduce. Okay, you can think about this in humans, right? If you are a human male and you are quite good looking, then the females, you know, are more likely to want to mate with you because, you know, they don't think of it this way, but basically they want your genes, so they'll have good looking kids and then their kids will pass on. Or let's say that you're very, very successful in your job, right? That must mean you're really smart or you're a go-getter or whatever. And so females may be more attracted to you because, you know, they know that they'll be taken care of, or they'll have, you know, a good, a good nest, you know, basically a place to live, you know, that kind of thing. Um, so, however, you're more adapted to your environment, you know, you're more likely to be to survive. Okay. Usually, there are more critters in each generation than actually survive. Okay. That's what this overproduction means. Okay. More critters than actually reproduce. Okay. Genetic variation means they're not all the same. Okay, something makes them different. And then there's this struggle to survive, right? This competition. Okay, so those that are better at this competition, their genetic variation, whatever it is, makes them more likely to reproduce. And so whatever makes them more likely to reproduce, they call that an adaptation, whether they're better at finding food, whether they're smarter, whether they are more camouflaged, whatever it is, they can fly faster. That is something that makes them successful. And so they're more likely to reproduce. If you have an adaptation that doesn't make it more likely for you to reproduce, better for you to reproduce, then it doesn't matter. Okay, it's not going to get passed on to the next generation unless you reproduce. Okay, and then your fitness is basically, that's not how much you work out or how much weight you can lift. That's how like how much you're providing to the next generation. Okay, so if you have lots of kiddos, you have a high fitness. So like those Duggar folks, they have lots and lots of children, so they technically have a high fitness in natural selection standpoint. That Octomom, she has a high fitness because she had lots of kiddos. Okay, so the more kiddos you have, the more fitness you have because you're promoting more of your DNA in the next generation. So now we can kind of step back and think about the fossil record. Fossils are remains or traces of organisms that died a long, long time ago. Organisms with really hard parts like bugs and things that have bones um, are better preserved than critters that are completely soft, like a jellyfish, right? A jellyfish is like 98% water. And so, you know, when it comes time to be turned into a fossil, it's not going to work, right? Because it's just gooey. It's not going to stay. There's no hard part to basically make that image or that cast. And then the relative age. You can compare the age of a fossil compared to other fossils. Now, most fossils, what happens is you have something that dies, right? I'm just going to draw a human because it's easy to draw. And then it gets kind of buried. And then you may have another human, right? This is before we were doing like graves and stuff like that, right? And then it gets buried. And then you have another one, it gets buried. They expect that this one is the oldest. And this is the newest because it's on the top. Okay, so that's relative age when we're comparing the ages of these. Now, the absolute age you can determine by radioactive dating. So if we say this is like, I don't know, I'm just making numbers up right now, 10,000 years old, and then 1,000 years old, and then 100 years old, that would be their actual age or their absolute age. Okay, I have no idea if those numbers are even accurate for humans. Okay, I just like made up numbers right there. So biogeography is then the study of where things live. So this is important to evolution because, for example, you see here, basically all the land on this side is somehow connected. Okay, or at least used to be connected. You can see here that it kind of connects there, and then it kind of goes, it's close. It's really close to being connected, right? And then over here, all of this is kind of connected. So the Bering Strait is usually that kind of limiting factor where it separated the, and so critters could not cross that Bering Strait very well. Okay, and so that's why, for example, we have leopards on the left side and an organism that is almost identical, a jaguar. They probably had a common ancestor, and then let's say they started over on the left side. At some point, they may have migrated across the Bering Strait and then not be able to anymore because it used to be closer together, used to be attached. And that created this jaguar population and this leopard population. Okay, they kind of diverged genetically eventually. Okay, so if things cannot interbreed, and if say like geographically, that means that they can't eventually they will become two different species. And so one of the ways we can tell that things evolved from one another is this thing called homologous structures. And that's basically, for example, these are vertebrates, but they have similar, these four species have similar bones, which there's I believe it's called Occam's razor. It's basically the easiest explanation is most likely the correct one. So, for example, there is, there's two explanations as to why all four of these critters have the same bones, okay, in their appendages. They could either originate from the same ancestor, right? Or they could have independently evolved exactly the same bones. Now, which is more likely? That one common ancestor evolved those bones, and then these are descendants from that common ancestor, and so all of these bones evolved once, or that these bones evolved at least 4 different times, right? The simplest explanation is that there was some common ancestor that had all of these bones, and then they came from there, okay? So you can see what they've done is they've kind of color coded them. So like this red bone is, sorry about that noise. This red bone is the same in all of these critters. The green ones are the same in all of these critters, and on and on. Okay. And then there's something called an analogous structure. Okay. So a homologous structure is when they come from a common ancestor. An analogous structure is something that is similar, but probably originated from different species. Okay. So for example, this, what is this, like a moth? Okay, this is a moth. This looks like a bird. This looks like a bat. And I don't know what flying thing this is. Maybe like a flying dinosaur or something. It's a flying dino. My kid would probably know this. So basically, all of these things have wings, right? But they aren't necessarily homologous structures just because they're all wings, right? A moth's wing is very different from a bird's wing or a bat's wing. So they probably evolved separately and then, came back. Now, you see these colored bones? These are the ones, the colored bones are probably like all these green ones. Those are probably homologous structures. But like a moth wing did not, like a bat's wing did not evolve from a moth wing. They are separate, and they evolved basically the same solution to the same problem, right? How to get into the air. So, and then there's something called a vestigial structure. Okay, and a vestigial structure is a structure that has no apparent function in the modern animal, but it clearly had some sort of point in a previous animal. So, for example, whales have this set of bones right here. And basically what they are is they're basically at what would be considered like the hip of the bone, and they are like little teeny tiny little middle, like leg bones, right? So basically, the previous ancestor of this whale probably had legs of some sort, and then once it went to the sea, over generations, it evolved to not need those legs anymore, and so all they have left are these little like nubbin bones, but the bones are still there, which let us know that the ancestor probably had them or needed them. So now we've talked about these different kind of structures. We can call these different things. So for example, convergent evolution is when different species evolve similar traits. So like the moth and the batwing, right? The same solution to the same problem, or a different solution, but they're both wings. That would be convergent evolution. Divergent evolution is when one species diversifies into a bunch of different species. So that would be like those finches, right? One finch went onto the island, and then it diversified to fill all those little different niches that weren't there. And then, I should say pattern. Adaptive radiation is basically a pattern of diverging until all of the niches have been filled. So like, for example, these finches on the island, because it was an island, there probably weren't a lot of birds in there. There's not a lot of competition. So these finches basically kept evolving until they filled every possible niche that they could fill, with the traits that they had. And then that was called adaptive radiation. So this one species basically radiated into all of these different species. And so that's why they call it adaptive radiation. Now we can talk about a type of evolution that is not natural. Usually it's humans causing it, and it's called artificial selection. And this is when humans choose who's going to be the parent at the next generation. So for example, dog breeds, right? We have two specific parents that are chosen usually because they have the most desirable characteristics, and they have offspring that look very similar to them, and then usually have those traits, the ones that with the best traits on that next generation, on and on. We do this with plants, right? For example, corn, back in the day, like natural corn, the cobs were very, very small, And so what farmers did is, before even genetics or anything like that we knew about, they just picked the biggest ones with the biggest cobs, and they let those, they planted those, and then that next generation had bigger cobs, and then on and on and on until we got these like um, corn cobs now that don't even resemble at all really what the original corn looked like, and that's because we kept choosing these larger and larger cobs to get that, the extra kernels. Coevolution is when two or more species have evolved adaptations to each other. And sometimes we call this a symbiosis. And so these organisms evolved to be like one another. So like a clownfish and a anemone, right? They have evolved to be similar. A coral has a type of algae that lives inside it called a zooxanthellae. And these algae photosynthesize and produce food for the coral, and the coral provides a very safe home for that type of algae. They are so co-evolved that you really don't find zooxanthellae living outside of a coral. They are so evolved to those corals. Um, that they actually, you rarely find zooxanthellae living on their own. That's why when a coral bleaches or it expels its zooxanthellae, it says, I can't handle you anymore, I can barely handle my own stuff, I need you out. And so it gets rid of the zooxanthellae. They cannot get zooxanthellae back because zooxanthellae just don't live in the environment. They really only live in corals. Now we've been talking about like individual species and things like that, and now we can talk about evolution from a genetic point of view or from the population point of view. So basically, this is, when we're looking at evolution from the point of genetics entirely. So for example, a population has a gene pool, and that is all of the genetic information available in that population. Okay, tall, short, skinny, larger, whatever the is in that gene pool, all of the traits, that's the gene pool. And then there's something that we call Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which we won't get into too much, but basically it means that Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium says that the genotype frequencies in a population tend to be the same from generation to generation unless acted on by an outside influence. So for example, if you had a population living in a very stable area, it's the same all the time, the gene frequencies are going to stay the same over generation to generation. But then let's say that all of a sudden some sort of pressure gets put on that population, like a new predator is introduced. The individuals that are more likely to be able to escape that predator, they're the ones that are going to survive to the next generation. So then their genes are the ones most likely to be in the next generation. And so then you're no longer going to have that same equilibrium of genotypes. You're going to have a new one. It's going to shift because that predator came into that area. And so that's basically what happens when you have an invasive species, is you've got that predator, that new species, and it's basically causing everyone else to, it's adjusting the genetics of the population. So now we can talk about the flow of genes. If you are immigrating, you are moving into a population. And the way I remember that is immigration has an I and into has an I. So they both have I's. And then immigration, it's pronounced exactly the same, really, immigration. But I'm going to pronounce it immigration that way since I'm talking, so you know the difference between the two. Immigration is moving out of a population. So, or you could say exiting. Okay, and so this would mean they both have E for exit. Okay, so immigration is exiting, immigration or immigration. Some people call it that immigration and immigration when you're talking about both. That way you know the difference when you're talking. It would be like into. And so the gene flow is the process of genes moving from one population to another. So let's say you've got some critters and they are immigrating from here to here. Not only are those individuals moving, but their genes are moving as well. And so their genetic material is now going to be in this population. Okay. Now, there's also something called genetic drift, and this is just totally random. And it doesn't happen a lot because usually what's going on is you're going to have some sort of factor in the environment is acting on an individual, causing that to continue. But let's say that you have two genes that are linked, okay, and one of them is really, really important, okay, like your ability to outrun a predator, and the other one is maybe your color, okay. So if your predator is really fast, then you need to be really fast. So the fastest individuals, okay, are going to be the ones that go to the next generation because they're the fastest, right? Well, let's say only the purple individuals are the fastest. Well, the purple ones are the only ones that even get a chance to mate because all the others get eaten before they can mate. So then the population kind of, they call it drifts, and so they end up being purple. Most of the population ends up being purple, not because purple is a specific characteristic that is selected for, but the color of the critter is linked to how fast they are. And so then the population starts drifting towards being purple, just because for the fact that the fastest individuals happen to be purple, because the purple color and the fast one is linked. And now there's something called non-random mating. In general, animals like to choose their mates. You don't like to be told who you're going to mate with. You like to choose. Okay? And so females have this thing, they call it sexual selection. And this is when females choose the mates they mate on based on a certain trait. So in humans, you could think of it as like a sports car. So a man might have a really, really nice sports car, right? And it's totally unpractical, right? There's nothing practical about a sports car. There's nothing useful about a sports car, right? It doesn't even hardly hold that many people, right? And you can't put that many groceries in it. But people like sports cars. They like the way they look, things like that. So you may be more drawn to a person because he has a really nice sports car, even though that sports car is totally useless. Okay, so the guy with the sports car may get more dates than the guy with the really, really old car, even though the really old car and the sports car, they are, completely irrelevant to the man, right? It doesn't matter, right? The guy with the sports car may get more dates because it's flashier or whatever. And so he may be more likely to reproduce just because he's got a sports car, even though it's not really super useful. So they call that sexual selection because the female is mating with someone for a trait, not for a trait, but they are picking an individual based on a trait that maybe isn't all that useful. So for example, like a peacock, that peacock tail is totally useless, right? In fact, that peacock tail makes it more difficult for the male peacock to survive because he's got this huge tail that he's got to keep track of. It slows him down. He's got to make sure it's beautiful at all times. It doesn't get ripped or whatever. It's this big pain in his, um, his side. Well, when he opens it, all the ladies are like, wow, that is one nice tail. And so a peacock with a really beautiful tail, a male peacock, is more likely to get dates or mate than a male peacock with a crappy tail. And so even though that tail's not super useful, it ends up being selected for because the lady people really like the tail. And so this often happens on men. Men are males. Males are more likely, all of these pictures are males, likely to have some sort of silly adaptation like this or silly trait that ends up getting passed on to the next generation because the females just go wild over it, even though it's kind of a silly trait and it doesn't really, it's not really helpful. In fact, it might even hinder them, right? Because it makes them slower, like this bird in the middle, right? I would think that having such a long might make it easier for a predator to chomp you because, you know, you might be able to get the edge of your tail and grab you. And so you'd think that wouldn't get selected for, but if the ladies really like it, it doesn't matter if you have a short stumpy tail and you can get away from the predators. If the ladies don't like your short stumpy tail, you're not going to have any babies and you're not going to pass your short stumpy tail on to the next generation. So that's kind of how sexual selection works. And so speciation is basically the process of forming a new species. So the biological species, there's a bunch of different concepts of species, but we tend to use the biological species concept. And this is that if you can interbreed, but you cannot, so you can produce offspring, and they call it viable offspring, then you are considered a species. So viable means that your babies can have babies. Okay. If your babies can have babies, then you're a species. If your babies cannot have babies, they're sterile, that means you're not a species. Okay. There's a couple ways that you can that you can separate in a new species. We talked about geographic isolation in the terms of the leopard and the jaguar, right? If they are in separate areas or they were in the same area and then something causes them to be separated, then they are likely to form a new species. So for example, the finch that traveled to the Galapagos originally was separated from his original population. He was geographically isolated, so then he ended up, you know, eventually forming new species, right? And then reproductive isolation is when the populations are separated and they can't interbreed. So for some reason they cannot interbreed. You can have reproductive isolation because your parts don't fit together, right? Okay, so let's say you have a Great Dane and a Chihuahua. It would be very difficult for them to mate. And so they might be reproductively isolated because their parts can't get to each other. And so that could be a type of reproductive isolation. Geographic isolation is another type of reproductive isolation. If you are in two different continents, you cannot reproduce with someone, right? It's impossible. So that's a type of reproductive isolation. Now we can talk about the different types of speciation. So allopatric speciation is basically like geographic isolation. So this is likely what happened with like the leopard and the leopard and the jaguar. Parapatric speciation would occur in a small local environment. So this would be like, say you have some sort of let's say you have a type of very, very small critter, and then you've got, you know, this watered area, and then a little bit, you know, it's close, but not that close. You've got another watered area. If you're living here and you have new generations very quickly, you could become a different species from the critters living over here. You're in the same like environment. You're just in two separate kind of areas. And then sympatric speciation is when species arise as a result of reproductive isolation. So let's say that, for example, Chihuahuas and Great Danes were the only dogs around, right? And they were natural. It was completely natural. Um, they might become two new species based on sympatric speciation because for whatever reason they're reproductively isolated, right? They can't get to each other. And then there's two theories on how species become new species. There's a gradualism idea that species just gradually change into new species. And then there's another idea called punctuated equilibrium, where critters go long periods of time without change, and then something happens in the environment that requires them to change very quickly. And so there's like long period, no change, no change, no change. Whoa, something crazy happens in the environment and they need to adapt to that. No change, no change, no change. Something crazy happens in the environment and they need to adapt to that. In reality, again, it's probably some combination of both, right? There's definitely gradualism occurring, but there also could be types of punctuated equilibrium. For example, that finch that went to the Galapagos, that could be one of those events that causes them to change rapidly because now there's all of these open niches and it's really easy to separate into different species, where if that individual had stayed on the mainland, it would probably gradually, maybe change into different species.